I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Zev Handel, professor at University of Washington. Before we begin, I would like to briefly introduce Dr. Zev Handel. Dr. Handel is a professor in the Department of Asian Languages and Literature at University of Washington and currently serves as an associate chair of the department. Dr. Handel received a PhD in Chinese language from University of California at Berkeley. His principal areas of research are historical phonology, Chinese language, Chinese dialects, Tibeto-Burman languages, Sino-Tibetan comparison, Chinese characters, and Asian writing systems. He has been an editorial board member and an associate editor of numerous influential journals in Chinese linguistics. Dr. Handel is one of 5 associate editors of the Encyclopedia of Chinese Language and Linguistics, a 5-volume set that will be widely used as a standard reference works in the field of Chinese linguistics. Dr. Handel has been publishing many academic articles in East Asian linguistics and writing systems. One of his current research projects is comparative study of the development of Chinese character-based writing systems in Asia. Dr. Handel's contribution to Korean linguistics has officially begun while staying in Korea for his sabbatical years 2008 to 2009 and 2014 to 2015. He has been serving as an editorial board member and a co-editor of Scripta, Journal of the Hunmin Society, since 2009. Dr. Handel served in the organizing committee for the first and second International Symposium on Sino-Korean Linguistics, which has been successfully promoting scholarly communications on Sino-Korean linguistics internationally. This international symposium strongly encourages active discussion of a wide range of topics in Chinese linguistics that are related to Korea, or the Korean language contact and borrowing between Chinese and Korean. Personally, I am one of the beneficiaries of his academic endeavors on Sino-Korean linguistics. Dr. Handel is my advisor for PhD dissertation on irregular Sino-Korean readings. Dr. Handel is one of several researchers who have recently received the 5-year Academy of Korean Studies lab grant for a large collaborative project on Korean at the nexus of the Northeast Asian linguistics area. I believe we are in for a real treat tonight. Now please welcome Dr. Zev Handel with a warm round of applause.
Well, hello everybody. It is such a pleasure and an honor to be here. I wanted to thank Societas Koreana for inviting me, and Jung-soo for working so hard to get me here successfully. And by the way, where are you sitting, Jung-soo? Yes, okay. By the way, you don't know this, but the Academy of Korean Studies has paid for my ticket, but not you. It's another branch. It's the grant that Sunmi just mentioned. So actually, yeah, it all evens out. Right. So, it's such a thrill for me to be here. I have 4 former students from my department in Seattle, Washington are here with us this evening. Jung-soo and Sunmi, who you just heard from, and also Chung-im and Uk-jin in the back there. And my parents-in-law are here as well over at the front table. So it's just such a thrill for me to be here and have, doesn't look good, and have, can someone help get rid of that? And have the opportunity to speak to you tonight about 2 topics that are very near and dear to my heart, which are the Chinese and Korean languages. Okay, it's gone, great. So let's just get right in. I want to make sure I finish in time for you to have time to ask questions and comments if you like, and for us to eat a nice dinner. Korea and China are neighboring polities whose interactions date back over 2,000 years, to a time long before the names Korea and China even existed. Over these last 2 millennia, the mutual influence of these 2 countries has touched on every aspect of culture, including governance, philosophy, religion, and language. And today I'm going to talk to you about the linguistic interactions that have taken place between Korean and Chinese, and especially about the ways that spoken Chinese and written Chinese have influenced the development of Korean language and writing. So let's begin with some simple observations and see where they lead us. If you look at a selection of basic vocabulary, common words, in modern Mandarin Chinese and modern Korean, there are no obvious similarities. And I'm going to read these for you because the romanizations here are not necessarily indicative of the pronunciations unless you know how they work. So eye in Mandarin Chinese, 眼睛, in Korean, 눈, ear, 耳朵, 귀, person, 人, 사람, sky, 天, 하늘, snow, 雪, 눈, red, 红, 빨강, to sleep, 睡, 자, to come, 来, 오, to fly, 飞, 날. The Chinese and Korean words are as different from each other as the English and Korean words are. No apparent similarities at all. And the grammars of Chinese and Korean are very different too. For example, in Korean, the verb comes at the end of the sentence, and in Chinese, the verb comes in the middle of the sentence, as in English. Korean verbs change form to indicate tense and to reflect degrees of politeness and formality, and this is done by attaching suffixes to the verb root. Chinese verbs don't change form at all and don't indicate these things. In Korean, noun phrases are marked with particles indicating their grammatical function, particles that say, I'm the subject or I'm the object of the sentence. Chinese has none of those. If you look at this simple sentence, the teacher saw the students, and compare the Chinese and the Korean, you can see that the grammatical structures and the grammatical functions and the word order, they're all completely different. So Mandarin, 老师看见了学生, and Korean, 선생님이 학생들을 보셨습니다. There's really no equivalent in the way these languages are structured. The many obvious differences in vocabulary and language structure reflect the fact that Chinese and Korean are what linguists call unrelated languages. And what we mean by that is that prior to the contacts between Chinese speakers and Korean speakers that began about 2,200 years ago, the two languages had separate, independent histories. Now, this is in striking contrast to, say, Spanish and Italian, right? If we compare the same exact set of vocabulary in Spanish and Italian, we get a very different impression of the relationship of these two languages. Eye, ojo, occhio, ear, oreja, orecchio, person, persona, persona, sky, cielo, cielo, snow, nieve, neve, red, rojo, rosso, to sleep, dormir, dormire, to come, venir, venire, to fly, volar, volare. Okay, so obviously similar, and of course these similarities are not an accident. These languages are what linguists call related. That is, they come from the same language. They're descended from Latin, as we all know. But another way to say the same thing is to say that 2,000 years ago, these two languages were Latin. They are just changed forms of Latin. And their similarities today are simply due to the fact that they have diverged over time from a common source. So returning to Chinese and Korean and those differences we saw, we can say that the differences reflect the fact that these two languages do not share a common ancestor. But there's more to say about the relationship between Chinese and Korean. If we look at a different set of vocabulary words, the comparison of Chinese and Korean appears to tell a very different story. So here's a set of words where the Chinese and Korean are very similar, and I will again pronounce these for you so you can hear it. China, 中国, 중국, brave, 勇敢, 용감, dinosaur, 恐龙, 공룡, grape, 葡萄, 포도, umbrella, 雨伞, 우산, black tea, 红茶, 홍차. Oh, there's cha. We'll talk more about that later. food product, 食品, 식품. Public, 公共, 公共. Library, 图书馆, 图书馆. So this apparent contradiction, the presence of both deep differences in the first set of words and the grammar, and the presence of these obvious similarities in this set of words, is one of the topics we're going to explore this evening. We're going to try to figure out how it got this way. Now, the data I've shown you so far is spoken language data. And by that I mean I've given you vocabulary words and I've given you pronunciations. What I haven't shown you is how these words are normally written by Chinese speakers and Korean speakers when they write their own languages. And I've done that on purpose because it's important that we carefully distinguish spoken language from written forms of language. And this is something that linguists put a great deal of emphasis on. So now let's turn to writing, because there's some interesting things about the writing too that we need to talk about. If we look at modern Korean and modern Chinese, their written forms appear to be completely unrelated. Right? You know Korean is written in the Hangul alphabet, as you can see in these street signs in Busan on the left, and Chinese is written in Chinese characters, as you can see in the street signs in Hong Kong on the right. And the difference is equally striking if we look at contemporary newspapers from Korea and China, all Hangul on the left and all Chinese characters on the right. But this very obvious and striking difference is somewhat misleading because it's actually a relatively new phenomenon. And if we go back less than a century, we find that written Korean was full of Chinese characters, interspersed with the Hangul alphabet. And so take a look at this Korean newspaper from the 1950s. I sometimes show this to Korean people, and they are kind of horrified because they can't read it, most of them. Can you imagine if you're American or French or Romanian and you pick up a newspaper in your own language from 50 years ago and you can't read it? What a strange thing. So in the first half of the 20th century, Korean had a mixed script writing system. That's what we call it, mixed script writing system. Some words were written in Chinese characters, and some were written in Hangul. But which words were written which way? The Korean words that I gave you in that first vocabulary set, the common basic words, those that bear no similarity to Chinese words, those were written in Hangul in the 1950s, just as they were today. So this is what these words would have looked like. In the right column, this is what these words would have looked like in a newspaper in the 1950s. And the middle column shows you how Chinese people would write those Chinese words. But here's how the second set of vocabulary, the words that sound similar to the Chinese words, would have been written in the 1950s in Chinese characters. These Korean words were not only written in Chinese characters, but you'll note they're exactly the same Chinese characters that the similar sounding Chinese words were written in and still are written in today. Okay, so what's going on here? This is something else we're going to talk about this evening. In the last half century, there's been a massive shift in the way Korean is written. Today, all the Korean words on this chart would normally be written in Hangul. The use of Chinese characters in written Korean is now extremely limited. It's not totally gone, but it's quite limited. And that's why Korean newspapers from the 1950s look so different from Korean newspapers we see today. So a little while ago, I just stressed that spoken language and written language are really different things, and we have to keep them distinct. But as you can see here, there's clearly a connection between them also. A century ago, Korean words, unlike Chinese, were written in Hangul, while Korean words that were similar to Chinese words were written in Chinese characters. So why this was so and why it's not so any longer is something we're going to talk about before you get dinner. By the way, I think probably as all of you know who've spent time here, Chinese characters are not completely gone from modern Korean writing in South Korea. And in fact, I opened the lecture very quickly with a Busan street scene. And if we go back to that, there's actually one visible Chinese character on this profusion of signs. And there it is. Okay, so they're not totally gone. They're just very, very minimally used. Okay, so to try to answer the questions I've raised about the language and the writing system, let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back to the time before the first known historical contact between speakers of Chinese and speakers of Korean, when the two languages had nothing in common at all. So we're talking about the first millennium BC. This is a very simplified map of China around the 7th century, and you can see the Korean peninsula hanging out there at the top. For much of this period, the first millennium BC, the area we now think of as China was divided into numerous kingdoms, connected by a complex web of alliances and rivalries and feudal relationships. Chinese characters had been invented around 1250 BC, around the 13th century BC, allowing the Chinese language to be set down in writing. And the invention of writing in China quickly propelled the development of Chinese civilization. So you get literature, philosophy, history, religion, political theory, bureaucratic administration, and so on. All of these things developed very rapidly. But beyond China proper, there were no written languages in East Asia in the first millennium BC at all. The spoken languages of the Korean peninsula, of the Japanese archipelago, of the countries of Southeast Asia like Vietnam, had no written counterparts. The world surrounding China, the known world to the Chinese, was not just illiterate, but ignorant of the very concept of writing. And then in the 3rd century BC, after a long period of warfare, the Chinese kingdom of Qin, which is, I think I have a laser pointer here. Yes, here, number 9 on this map, the Chinese kingdom of Qin, succeeded in conquering all the other states of China and established the first Chinese empire. This was a vast, multi-ethnic region ruled by a single man who invented and took for himself the new title of emperor. And although that first imperial dynasty lasted only 15 years, it was followed by the very powerful and stable Han dynasty, which lasted for 400 years. And the map under the Han Empire looked like this. The Han undertook a series of military campaigns, and they extended the reach of the empire to the west, the east, and the south. And it was at this time that Han soldiers first pushed into the northern reaches of the Korean peninsula, where they defeated local tribes and established what the historians call commanderies, that is, military administrative units, in the year 108 BC, and this is where those commanderies were located. Now, at this time, too, it's important to realize that Korea was not a unified polity. It, too, was a collection of kingdoms and tribal states. And at this time, the Koreans living in the north here were now exposed in significant numbers for the first time to the Chinese spoken language and to Chinese writing and the realization that writing exists. Writing is a possible thing in the world. Now, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of historical records about what happened during this period in this area, so we don't know a lot about the interaction between Chinese and Korean languages. But we do know that it is around this time that scholars believe that the first vocabulary words were borrowed from Chinese into spoken Korean. And only a handful of those have survived, but some have survived down into the modern Korean language. These words have been in Korean for so long, and in some cases they have come to look so dissimilar from their Chinese origins, that they are indistinguishable from native Korean vocabulary, and nobody other than a few scholars even recognizes that these words are not originally Korean. So let me show you a few of these very early words that were likely borrowings from Chinese. The modern Korean word for wind, param, is perhaps a borrowing from ancient Chinese prum, which is now pronounced feng in modern Mandarin. It's changed quite a bit in the history of Chinese. The Korean word for bowl, kurut, a likely borrowing from ancient Chinese kruts, which is now pronounced qi in modern Mandarin. Writing brush and ink stick are more obvious borrowings when you see the ancient Chinese and the modern Korean forms, put from put and muk from muk. So these are just 4 of the examples of a small number of words that are suspected to be very, very early borrowings from the Chinese language into the Korean language. So we'll come back to the borrowing of vocabulary and trace the later history in a little bit, but first I want to take you on a detour into the world of writing systems. So linguists define writing as the written representation of speech. And by this definition, writing is not just any kind of visual communication. Writing corresponds to specific utterances in a specific language. And what this means is all of these things on the left are not writing. Because although they communicate ideas, and in some cases they communicate ideas quite specifically, those ideas can be articulated in many ways. These images do not correspond to any single utterance in any single language. So just to give one example, if I want to change the meaning of this sign into words, I could say no smoking, or smoking prohibited, or do not smoke. And for that reason, it's not writing. It doesn't have just one way to be read. Oh, I've done something. There we go. Okay, I hit the wrong button. There we go. This is writing. There's only one way to read this, and in only one language. This says pedestrian access only beyond this point. Okay, so that is writing. In the era before telephones, before voice recording devices, the invention of writing allowed people to overcome the two great limitations of spoken language, which are limitations of time and space. Right? Speech is fleeting. A few seconds after you hear it, it's gone. And speech, if I didn't have this microphone, speech is limited in how far it can be projected. But once you have writing, you can make speech transmittable across vast distances of time and space. And this makes a whole host of social and cultural and economic structures and activities possible that are not possible in a purely oral society. But note that writing is language specific. The graphic elements, so what I mean by that is this is only English. Writing is language specific. But an interesting thing is that the graphic elements that make up the writing are not language specific. I'm talking about the letters. So let me explain to you what I mean. Let me give you an example. Okay, look at these passages. These are all writing. They all have the familiar letters of the Roman alphabet in them. You'll see A and M and S and so on. But it would be foolish to say that because they're all written in what we might casually call the English alphabet, that they're all English. The way we know what language they're written in is if we know the words and the grammar. Okay, so only one of these is English. Which one of these is English? Language 4, okay. Do any of you know the other? Does anyone recognize any of the other languages? We've got such a crowd in this room. Polish is the second one, that's correct. Bahasa Indonesia, yes. Indonesia is the first one, very cool.
Is it the number 3? Can it be Turkish or Finnish?
It is not Turkish or Finnish, but that's actually not a bad guess. Hungarian, no. Any other takers? It is Kazakh. It is the language of Kazakhstan. And these are the official written forms. These are not transliterations. This is how these languages are written by the people who speak these languages. So only the one that consists of words and grammatical structures of English is English writing. Okay, so the point here is we have to actually distinguish the script, the graphic forms, from the language elements, the words, the grammar. Even though ordinary people tend to conflate the two. We tend to have a hard time keeping those distinct. Okay, let's look at some other examples of written language. So this is I do this in class. I show these to my students in class. Any idea about languages? I heard Arabic. Which one do you think is Arabic? Yeah. It's not Arabic and it's not Persian. It is not Mongolian. It is not Hindi. So you have recognized the Arabic script. You're absolutely right. This is the same set of graphs that are used in Arabic writing. How about this one? It sure looks like Russian, but it's not Russian. It's the Cyrillic alphabet. It is not Ukrainian. That's a good guess. Ukrainian's also written in the...
Bulgaria came up with this word, right?
Yeah, it's not Bulgarian, though. These are good guesses. But... Okay, let's forget about 5 and 6. Number 7? Kazakh, right. You remember that. It's the same as number 3. Okay. Kazakh. Not only is this the same language, this is the same passage. Same words, same order. This is the beginning of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, written in Kazakh, in scripts that have been at various times in history the official writing system of Kazakh. Okay, so what have we learned? Just like one script, the Roman alphabet can be used to write multiple languages, English, Indonesian, Polish, etc. One language can be written with different scripts. We tend to associate particular scripts with particular languages, right? Arabic script with Arabic, Cyrillic script with Russian, depending on what European country you come from, the Roman alphabet with your language. But the relationship is far more fluid than we usually imagine. This is because scripts can be borrowed across cultures and repurposed to write other languages, and they often are. The spread of scripts around the world tends to follow lines of cultural and religious and political influence. So the Roman script originally spread through Europe and got used for other languages with the expansion of the Roman Empire, and then later expanded beyond Europe with the spread of Roman Catholicism and Protestantism and colonialism. And the Arabic script spread with the spread of Islam. The Cyrillic script with the spread of the Russian Orthodox Church, and later with the expansion of Russian and then Soviet political power. Overlapping waves of influence often lead to the existence of multiple ways of writing the same language, which may vie over time for official status. And that's exactly what's happened to Kazakh. Kazakhstan is located in kind of the intersection of various waves of influence from different great powers around it, and religions, politics, culture, and it has fallen under the sway of different ones at different times, and that has affected how the language has been written. Okay, so that's an important lesson because when we talk about Chinese characters in Korean, we have to bear in mind that script and language don't necessarily align in the ways that we're used to thinking about. Human speech predates writing by tens of thousands of years. All of us today live in a fully literate society. We're surrounded by and we're immersed in writing. And for that reason, it's really, really hard for us to imagine what a world would be like, how we would move through a world that had no writing at all. But it's also important to remember that our experience is very unusual for our species. Before the modern era, literacy was rare. And before 5,000 years ago, literacy didn't exist because writing didn't exist. So humans lived in a world of exclusively oral linguistic interaction. The very concept of writing, the idea that speech could be precisely and accurately represented in a visual form, was quite literally beyond the realm of imagination until about 5,000 years ago. The invention of writing, by which I mean the invention of the very idea of writing, the notion of writing, is one of the greatest achievements of our species, and it is rare. It has happened fewer than half a dozen times in the history of our species. 4 independent inventions of writing have been confirmed by scholars. And when I say independent invention of writing, I mean the invention of writing by people in a society who had never been exposed to the idea of writing before. So let me just introduce these 4. You may have a good guess of what they are. Sumerian cuneiform is the earliest, invented around 3200 BC in Mesopotamia. Very soon after, Egyptian hieroglyphs in Egypt, around 3100 BC. Then, about 2,000 years later, Chinese characters invented in ancient China. And about 1,000 years after that, completely independently in Mesoamerica, Mesoamerican hieroglyphs. And that's it. There are no other confirmed inventions of writing by people who didn't already know that writing was possible. And of these 4 primary scripts, these foundational inventions of writing by human beings, only one has been in continuous use down to the present. And of course it's Chinese. The other 3 are extinct. So Chinese is really special. Now I want you to imagine something. This is very hard to imagine. Imagine you are in a pre-literate society. So you don't read and write. You don't know anyone who reads and writes. And the very idea of reading and writing is not something that would ever occur to you. It's just not part of the world. And then one day you encounter a society that has this magical ability to look at scratches on a hard surface and repeat word for word something that was said years ago. You would want to learn how to do that, right? That seems really, really useful. And what do you think would be the surest way to learn how to do that? The natural thing for people to think of is to learn that language. To learn that language and that way of writing. And that is exactly what happened on the Korean Peninsula in the 1st century BC after the encounter with Chinese. And continuing on for several centuries later, local Korean speakers became trained to assist in the administration of these military commanderies run by Chinese administrators, and they learned to read and write Chinese, the Chinese language. Chinese words, Chinese grammatical order, written in Chinese characters. And as knowledge of writing spread south through the Korean Peninsula and local kingdoms in other parts of the peninsula began to make use of writing, the number of scribes who could read and write in Chinese gradually increased. But at this time, there was no such thing as written Korean. So if the king wanted to record something important or make a proclamation, the king would call a scribe. And the king would say in Korean, "Here's what I want you to write down." And the scribe would translate in his head, he, as far as we know, they were all men, into Chinese and write it down in Chinese. And then when the king needed to know what had been written down years earlier, he would call a scribe. The scribe would read the Chinese and then translate it aloud into Korean. And this is the reason that the earliest examples of Korean writing, or I should say, the earliest examples of writing on the Korean Peninsula are all written in classical Chinese. That was the literary language of the time, and the only literary language of the time. This is the Kwanggeto stele, erected in the year 414 by King Jangsu of Goguryeo, and it's one of the earliest surviving examples we have of writing on the Korean Peninsula. It's very imposing, and the written language is classical Chinese. It's not Korean. It was only gradually that literate Koreans, so people who spoke Korean as their native language but read and wrote classical Chinese as their written language, it was only gradually that these people figured out how to record Korean as a written language. So remember, the Korean alphabet wasn't invented until the 15th century. But by around the 7th century, Koreans had developed a very ingenious method for writing down spoken Korean using their knowledge of Chinese. Our surviving examples of this technique are, perhaps not surprisingly, examples of Korean poetry. Because poetry is a medium that relies on aspects of linguistic form, right? Sound, rhythm, meter, rhyme. These are things you can't just translate into classical Chinese and write down. Poetry has to be recorded in the language of the poem. So, how did the Koreans do it? How did they use Chinese characters, which they only knew, as a way to write Chinese in order to write down Korean? Well, to understand the technique, we're going to do a little experiment with writing English in Chinese characters. So we have to understand a little something about how Korean scribes were trained to read and write Chinese. So let's say I was going to teach you 3 Chinese characters to teach you to read and write Chinese. Let's pretend we're all native English speakers here. So if I said, I want you to learn these 3 Chinese characters. Here are their pronunciations, 四, yu, and I. And they mean for, to, the preposition to, and love. And I said, learn them. What would you do? Well, maybe if you're above a certain age, you would make flashcards. So you'd write the Chinese character on one side, and on the back you'd write the pronunciation and the meaning in English, and then you'd test yourself until you got to the point where you could recognize the form of the character, and you would be able to pronounce it, probably with an accent. That's okay, you're not a native speaker of Chinese. And you would be able to identify the meaning by saying an English word with the same meaning. Okay, that's how Korean scribes did it. It's exactly how they did it. They learned to associate with each Chinese character its pronunciation in a Korean accent and its meaning as expressed by a Korean word. But of course, they couldn't write it down. They didn't have flashcards. So they did all this orally. They memorized pronunciation and Korean meaning for each Chinese character. Now here's the thing. This is a really amazing and magical thing. It's something that humans do. If you know the pronunciations and meanings of Chinese characters in English, you can use them to write English. And you can do it in a way that other English speakers can puzzle out, even if they don't know how you did it. I'm going to show you how to do this. So, for example, based on the meaning of this character, we could use the character to write the English word to. This is what we call semantic adaptation. In fact, so this is how we could write 3 English words with these 3 characters. We could use them to write the English words that are synonymous or equivalent to the Chinese words. So I'll use the first character to write the English word for, I'll use the second character to write the English word to, and the third character to write the English word love. Of course, this is only going to get us so far. We won't be able to write down every possible English word or sentence this way. Why? Because there are going to be some English words that have no Chinese equivalents, and there's no character. These might be words for certain kinds of plants and animals that don't exist in China, or words for cultural items like cooking techniques or sporting activities, or words for philosophical or religious concepts that don't translate precisely. And moreover, there are going to be some grammatical elements of English that have no meaningful equivalent in Chinese, like the verbal ending ing, ing. With these characters right here, I can write love, but how do I write loved, or loving, or loves? There's no obvious way to do that with this semantic adaptation. However, there's another technique we can use. We can ignore the meaning of the characters that we've learned and use them purely for their sound value, the pronunciations we've memorized. And in this way, these same 3 characters could be used to write 3 different English words. I could use yu to write you, and I to write I, and ice to write ice, and so on and so forth. So by combining these 2 techniques, semantic adaptation and phonetic adaptation, using the meaning value of the character or the sound value of the character, and taking advantage of context and common sense, we can start writing complete sentences in English with Chinese characters. Okay, so it's your job now to read these 3 English sentences on the right. I've put on the left the various ways we've already come up with of representing some English words with Chinese characters, and you should be able to puzzle out these English sentences on the right, I think. I'll give you a moment. Anyone got number 1 yet? I love you. Very good. That's very nice. Yes. Okay, number 2 is a little weirder.
You love ice.
You love ice. Yes. Yes. So if you order some more water from the waiter and say, fill it with ice, and the waiter might say, number 2. Oh, you love ice. How about number 3? I love ice. Yeah, number 3 looks so weird, right? I. If you're a Chinese speaker, I. But it's an English sentence. Okay, this is English. We're writing English in Chinese characters. If you knew Chinese really well, you could iterate this process pretty quickly and pretty much write everything you needed to. But I want to emphasize something. I've said this several times, but I'll say it again. These 3 sentences are written in Chinese characters, but they're not Chinese. They're English. They're English words in English word order. And if we invited a Chinese speaker, a native Chinese speaker, into this room and hid the left side of the screen and said, read those sentences, the Chinese speaker would say, that's just gibberish, it's nonsense, it's not anything. Because that speaker is assuming, on seeing the Chinese script, that the writing should be Chinese, and they're wrong, the writing is English. And this is exactly what Koreans did. This is how Koreans wrote down poetry in the 7th century to 15th centuries, before the alphabet was invented, and other kinds of linguistic representations of Korean as well. The effective use of this technique requires a sufficient number of people who know Chinese, because they need to know sounds and meanings associated with Chinese characters. If you have a sufficient number of those people, they can use this method to write the Korean language. And let me show you an example of a famous Korean poem written in Chinese characters using this technique. This is the Song of Cheong, believed to have been composed in the 9th century. I don't know if that went away by itself or someone made it go away, but either way, that's good. Okay, this is read right to left, top to bottom in the traditional way, and it is Korean. Again, if you, when I say it's Korean words in Korean word order, with all those Korean grammatical particles and suffixes on the verbs and all that stuff, and a Chinese speaker looking at this would recognize every single character and say, this is gobbledygook, this is just nonsense. But an educated Korean person of the 9th century could recite the poem by reading this. Okay, that's really cool. All right, now we understand how writing works. We're ready to talk about the formative period of the influence of Chinese on the Korean language. The one that led to this situation, a set of Korean words very similar to Chinese words. Even though Korean could be written down using Chinese characters, it was not often done, because the official written language of Korea remained classical Chinese. Chinese was the language of high culture. It was the language of Confucianism and Buddhism, the language of fine literature and of government and administration, and of all the books and texts that came from China. So while some kinds of informal writing were done in Korean, or poetry was done in Korean, written Chinese remained the prestige written language. And for those of you familiar with the history of Europe, we see a strong analogy in the role of Latin, vis-a-vis the role of European vernaculars in the Middle Ages, right? Latin was the language of church and of government and of scholarship and of literature, while ordinary people were speaking medieval precursors to English and French and German and Italian and Spanish and Romanian and so on. When the kingdom of Shilla unified much of the Korean peninsula in the year 668, classical Chinese writing had become well established already. The administrative state was organized along Chinese models, and the ranks of literate elites were growing. There was relatively little direct interaction at this time between Korean speakers and Chinese speakers, but Korean and Chinese literate elites were part of a transnational cultural group that communicated in classical Chinese across borders. And they had a common worldview and a common educational background. So more and more Koreans were becoming familiar with written Chinese vocabulary, mainly encountered in written form rather than hearing it from Chinese people. And they began inserting these Chinese words that they knew into their spoken Korean. And Korean became a hybrid language of sorts. It retained its native grammar and its basic vocabulary, but acquired a massive overlay of thousands and thousands of borrowed words, which started with the literate elites and then spread throughout the spoken language. And this is the vocabulary we call Sino-Korean, meaning Korean words of Chinese origin. These high prestige words, as I said, were first used by the highly educated and then spread out through the whole language so that today they are just an ordinary part of the Korean language. And in many cases, this led to a situation where the spoken language had 2 words for basically the same thing. One, the ordinary Korean word that had always been there, and then a kind of fancier, more formal, more educated Chinese word that had been borrowed into the language. And you see a lot of these doublets exist today in Korean. So the ordinary Korean word for to eat is 먹다. But there's also a word to eat borrowed from Chinese, 식사하다. The hada part is Korean, but the shiksa part is Chinese. To use, we have the ordinary Korean word 쓰다, but we have a Chinese word, 사용하다. We have an ordinary word for clothing, 옷, and we have a fancy Chinese borrowing for clothing, 의복. We have an ordinary word for drawing, 그림, and we have a borrowed fancy Chinese word, 회화, for the same thing. And this kind of layering of vocabularies, it's hardly unique to Korean. This too is an ordinary event in the world. Something very similar happened in Japan and Vietnam, which have their layers of Sino-Japanese and Sino-Vietnamese vocabulary. And of course, the same thing happened in English. English absorbed an enormous number of fancy vocabulary words from French after the French conquered England in the 11th century, after the Battle of Hastings. So we get these pairs of words in English. The ordinary, normal, simple English word, and then the sort of fancy, high prestige, more formal French borrowing. Eat and dine, clothes and vestments, ship, vessel, go up, ascend, walk, ambulate, job, vocation. And ordinary speakers of English, who maybe have no idea that some of these words come from French, they still feel it. They feel the difference between the ordinary, common, simple words and the kind of fancier, more educated, more prestigious words. So in many cases, Korean has these doublets, the original Korean word and the borrowed Chinese word, the Sino-Korean word, that coexist in the language. But interestingly, over time, in some cases, the original Korean word has fallen out of use. And the borrowed Chinese word has kind of taken over its position as just the ordinary, normal Korean word. And when that happens, the Sino-Korean word loses its prestige factor, and it stops feeling like a borrowed Chinese word to Korean speakers. And I want to give you a few examples of these borrowed words from Chinese that have come to seem very ordinary in Korean. And you'll recognize them if you know even a little Korean as very common words. 방, meaning room, that's Chinese. 문, meaning door, that's Chinese. 산, meaning mountain, that's Chinese. 백, 100, that's Chinese. And 책, book, is Chinese. And some of the replacements, that is the loss of the original Korean word and the Sino-Korean word shifting to take its place, have happened pretty recently. And we can actually see, if we look at dictionaries over the last few hundred years, we can actually see this happening. So, if we go back only a few hundred years, we can see that the Korean word for mountain used to be mue. And after mue fell out of use, the borrowed Chinese word for mountain became the ordinary Korean word. And pek, the old Korean word for pek, was on. And I think most Koreans today, although they don't use it, I think they probably recognize it as an obsolete word and have some familiarity with it. Okay, so we've already seen that before the invention of Hangul, Chinese characters could be used in two ways to represent the Korean alphabet. And that's the experiment we did with writing English in Chinese characters, right? So just to recap, if we took this Chinese character, which writes a Chinese word meaning four, in the old days in Korea, before the alphabet, you could use that two ways. You could use it for its meaning value to write the Korean word for four, the Korean word net. And you could use it for its sound value to write a syllable in any Korean word pronounced sa. Just like we use I to write either love or the English word I. But after the borrowing of so many Chinese words into Korean, a new word for four entered the Korean language. The Sino-Korean word for four. The Chinese word for four got borrowed into Korean as sa. And if you wanted to write that word down when you were writing Korean, you would also use this character. So now this character had three possible uses. It could write the word borrowed that originally used that character in Chinese, or it could write two Korean words that matched the Chinese in sound or meaning. But after the invention of Hangul in the 15th century, this situation started to change. And it really changed when we got to the 20th century. Why did it take so long? Why did it take 400 years before the invention of Hangul really shifted the way Korean was written? It's because although Hangul had some advocates, it was mostly despised and denigrated by educated elites in Korea, who viewed it as a debasement of Korea's cultural heritage. Just like medieval Europeans thought that it was improper to write anything important in anything other than Latin. Not long after King Sejong promulgated the new Hangul script, the conservative intellectual Che Ma-li had this to say about it in an official complaint that he delivered to the throne in 1444. Our dynasty from the time of our ancestors has complied with the great standards of China. If the Chinese hear about the new alphabet and present their objections, it will be our shame. Barbarians, such as the Mongols, the Tongats, the Jurchens, the Japanese, and the Tibetans, all have their own scripts. But this is a matter of being barbaric. It does not merit consideration. Now, if we create our own alphabet and discard China and make ourselves alike to the barbarians, we would proverbially desert the fragrant herbs for the dung of a praying mantis. How could this not be a setback to our civilization? And of course, he wrote this in classical Chinese. It was only toward the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century that modernist reformers finally succeeded in replacing the classical Chinese written language with a written form of Korean as the official written language of Korea. So this is a relatively recent thing, that if you write something important, such as a government document, you write it in Korean instead of Chinese. But that doesn't mean it was all written in the Hangul script. As we saw at the beginning of the talk in this newspaper, Chinese characters were still widely used along with the Hangul script. And when were they used? They were used only to write the words of Chinese origin. The Sino-Korean vocabulary was written in Chinese characters. And the native Korean words and the Korean grammatical particles were written in the Hangul alphabet. So actually, as you scan this, if you know Hangul, anything you see here that isn't Hangul, it's a Korean vocabulary word that was borrowed from Chinese. And anything you see in Hangul is a native Korean word or something grammatical. And incidentally, it's precisely because King Sejong, back in the 15th century, and his advisors who made the script knew that Chinese characters in Hangul would be used side by side, that the Hangul letters get grouped into syllable blocks instead of being laid out in a line like most alphabets we're familiar with. So this way of organizing the letters brings them into conformity with the shape and function of Chinese characters, which occupy slightly elongated rectangles and always have one-syllable pronunciations. So this is kind of interesting. Even if you know no Korean and no Chinese and can't recognize a letter of Hangul and don't know a single Chinese character, you can count spoken syllables. Each rectangular block is a spoken syllable of Korean. That's pretty neat. Okay, we're almost done with our journey through the history of Korean absorption of Chinese loanwords. We have two more historical borrowing events, and I'm probably running a little behind schedule, but I will try to move along quickly. In the second half of the 19th century, contact between the West and the major East Asian countries of China, Korea, and Japan intensified. So the West aggressively sought trade and colonial footholds in Asia, and East Asian nations responded by modernizing to meet the superior military and technological ability of Western powers. So intellectuals in East Asia at the end of the 19th century began to study Western civilization in earnest, leading to a massive wave of translation of American and European texts on politics and science and history, philosophy, and novels also. You name it, everything was getting translated. The desire to engage with these topics spawned a need for lots of new vocabulary that could accurately render new Western concepts and institutions. And it was in Japan, following the Meiji Restoration of 1868, that this engagement with the intellectual output of the West happened soonest and most intensively. So it was Japanese people who ended up coining new Japanese words for a lot of important Western concepts. Concepts like society, bank, telephone, democracy, and so on and so forth. So how did they do it? What was the way that the Japanese came up with to make equivalent Japanese words? Well, let me give you an example. Take the word democracy. Okay, democracy in English is composed of two Greek roots, demos and krasi, rule by the people. What the Japanese did is they took the Chinese characters for people and rule, and they put them together to make a new compound word, which they pronounced in their Sino-Japanese way, with their Japanese pronunciation, as Minshu. And this written word made its way to Korea and China, where it was encountered in written form and pronounced according to the way Chinese and Korean people pronounce those characters. So you get the Chinese word minju and the Korean word minju. The result of this process, repeated over and over, is that in the late 19th and early 20th century, Korean acquired hundreds and hundreds of compound words from Japan. But because these words were also adapted into Chinese from Japan, and because they were pronounced just like any other Sino-Korean words and written in Chinese characters, they look exactly the same as those words borrowed from Chinese centuries and centuries before. They're in disguise. If you like, they're Japanese words in Chinese disguise. Japanese words in Chinese clothing. Among the Sino-Korean words that are actually Japanese in origin and not Chinese in origin are these: 원자, atom; 철학, philosophy; 은행, bank; 회사, company; 정보, information; 열차, train; 추상, abstract as opposed to concrete; 전화, telephone; and 의회, parliament, and hundreds of others. It's a massive amount of vocabulary. Okay, the last set of words for us to consider this evening are direct borrowings from Chinese that took place after the major layer of Sino-Korean borrowings and independently of this massive layer of Japanese borrowings. And these borrowings from Chinese are more sporadic, they're less systematic, they resulted from encounters of Korean travelers to China, or the adaptation of religious practices, or importation of Chinese foods or other cultural items into Korea. And these words, though very obviously to a linguist are of Chinese origin, they're pronounced differently from the Sino-Korean readings of characters because they're copied from more recent Chinese pronunciations. So I'll give you just a few examples of words like this. They're really quite interesting. The word for Napa cabbage, pechu, is borrowed from an early Mandarin form of what is now pronounced bai cai, meaning white vegetable. But it doesn't sound like the Korean pronunciations of those Chinese characters. And most Korean speakers don't think of it as a Sino-Korean word for this reason. There's also this really interesting word, jidan, which refers to a thin omelet made out of a separated egg yolk and egg white, and you'll recognize it. It's used in a lot of fancy Korean dishes. It actually comes from the Chinese word for egg, the Chinese word for chicken egg, jidan. And sometimes you'll actually see in written Korean, 달걀 jidan, which is using the Korean word for egg in front of this borrowed Chinese word to specify this is egg, an egg dish. This is egg jidan. And etymologically, this is actually hilariously redundant because etymologically, this is chicken, egg, though of course no Korean person would ever think of it that way. Okay, and then there's tea, Chungsu. This one's for you. The English word tea is from Chinese. In fact, almost every language in the world has its word for tea borrowed from Chinese. These include all the European words for tea that sound more or less like the English word tea. This includes the Indic word chai, which also comes from a Chinese source. And as a general rule, there are two pathways of borrowing out of China for words for tea all around the world. One is a coastal pronunciation from southeast China of the word for tea that sounded something like de, and it was sailors that brought that word to Europe, and any word you encounter for tea that starts with a t or a d sound came from this Chinese word de from the southeast coast. There's also the northern Mandarin word for tea, which is cha, and that moved by land through Russia and into India, and all of the words around the world for tea that start with a ch sound come from that Mandarin word for tea from the north of China. Within the history of Chinese, these two dialect words for tea are historically the same. And the de pronunciation is older. The cha pronunciation is newer. So the Korean pronunciation of this character is associated with two readings, cha and ta. And ta is the older pronunciation. It's the Sino-Korean layer. It's the one that came in the 9th century from China. But the other pronunciation, cha, is the newer one that comes from an early form of Mandarin from the north of China, and it's taken over. So now cha is the ordinary word for tea in Korea, and it's become the associated pronunciation of the Chinese character. But the pronunciation ta is still found. It's still in set expressions, it's still in dictionaries, and it's still known to Korean speakers. Okay, we're coming to the conclusion, and I've really made you sit for a long time without your dinner, so I promise I will finish soon. For nearly 2,000 years, the greatest influence on Korean language, both in terms of spoken vocabulary and writing, was Chinese. And as a result, Korean is full of Chinese vocabulary. By some estimates, around 70% of the Korean vocabulary is of Chinese origin. But it's important to remember that most commonly used basic words are still of Korean origin. And it's only starting in the 19th century that the influence of Japanese and then the influence of English eclipsed the influence of Chinese on the Korean language. And this began with the influx of Japanese words that I mentioned, the ones that are disguised as Chinese words. And then, of course, during Japanese occupation in the first half of the 20th century, more borrowed words from Japanese, words like kabang for bag and kudu for shoes, came from Japanese. And of course, from the second half of the 20th century, English borrowings predominated. And now, as you know, there are hundreds, maybe thousands of English borrowings in Korea, and still growing all the time. The result of all these borrowings is like a layered palimpsest of vocabulary in Korean, so you get these really interesting triplets sometimes. So here are three words that basically mean meeting in Korean. Moim is the native ordinary Korean word for a gathering of people or a meeting. Hwehap is the fancy Sino-Korean borrowed word. And then there's this recent word from English, meeting, which some people are chuckling because it's acquired this, kind of specialized meaning of a kind of group blind date, right? Where there's a bunch of boys and a bunch of girls and they all go out together because it's safer that way and get to meet each other over dinner. So there are lots of triplets like these. They're really fun. And what usually happens is the meanings of the words get slightly distinguished, so they all have a role to play in the language. The popularity of English in Korea doesn't look likely to abate soon. And given the high percentage of the Korean population that has studied English and knows some amount of English, we can expect more and more English borrowings to come in all the time. But as you all know, Chinese language and culture have been getting increasingly popular in Korea in recent decades, and more Koreans are learning modern Mandarin Chinese. So although we can't say for sure what's going to happen politically and culturally in the next few decades, it seems at least possible that a new wave of Chinese vocabulary could come into Korean from all these Koreans who know Chinese words. When it comes to writing, the question of what will happen is maybe even more interesting because the future of Chinese characters within written Chinese is uncertain. For most Korean people in most contexts, they don't need Chinese characters. Using and knowing Chinese characters isn't necessary for being literate, for communicating and writing. And so there's little practical incentive to tell someone they have to sit down and memorize hundreds or thousands of Chinese characters in elementary school. Even though the Ministry of Education's guidelines may call for teaching them, and those guidelines change frequently, depending on how the Korean government feels about the Chinese government and how nationalist it feels, it will increase or decrease the number of characters that elementary school children are expected to learn. So, it's possible to imagine that here in South Korea, as in North Korea, Chinese characters could disappear entirely, and they would then become esoteric knowledge, right, known only to scholars or history buffs. But we can imagine another pathway, too, because the cultural appeal of Chinese characters, the sort of affection Koreans have for them, remains strong. And now you've got all these Koreans learning Chinese and learning characters in the context of learning Chinese as a second language. Why do Koreans still use Chinese characters at all if they don't need them? There are a number of reasons, and it's culturally quite interesting. Sometimes they use them for efficiency, because you can use up less space with Chinese characters than with Hangul on signs or in newspapers, and that's of some value, because often one Chinese character can do the work of 2 syllables of Hangul. They can be used for clarification. So if you're introducing a new technical term in Hangul and people don't know what it means, if you put the Chinese characters, then people who recognize those characters can guess the meaning of the word. This word kasoki for an accelerator, like in physics, like a particle accelerator. It may be mysterious to you if you're not a physicist, but if you put the characters that mean add, speed, machine next to it, then in the right context, a reader who doesn't know the word can probably figure out what it means if they know the Chinese characters. Chinese characters can also be used in lots of fun ways, for wordplay, for punning, and we'll see a nice example on the next slide, and for various stylistic purposes, including making things seem fancy or old-fashioned. You see them on a lot of signs for shops because they convey a certain feeling. Okay, here's the example I want to show to you of how Chinese characters can be really fun and playful. This is an ad for Seoul brand milk. I think this ad campaign was in 2006. The character at the top right, this one, is pronounced yu. And it's the second character in the word for milk, which is a Sino-Korean word. It's a borrowing from Korean, the word uyu, milk, which comes from the 2 Chinese pieces, cow, milk. So this is the milk part. And even in 2006, many people maybe didn't recognize this character, so the pronunciation of it is helpfully given in Hangul right here, yu. And then we realize that this is an English sentence, right? I love you, if you use the Korean pronunciation. Or, if you know the meaning of the character, you get a different English sentence. I love milk, which is what the ad wants to say for selling milk. Okay, so as we think about the future of Chinese characters, don't discount this. Because languages and writing systems don't develop for maximal efficiency. There are lots of other cultural factors that come into play that affect the way language and writing develop. And efficiency is not the most important of those. And helping foreigners learn the language is not the most important of those. So what's going to happen with Chinese characters? Only time will tell. No language is ever spoken in complete isolation. Speakers of different languages interact with each other, directly or indirectly, and vocabulary words cross the boundaries between them. The vocabulary of Korean, like English, is a great palimpsest, formed from the accreted layers of borrowed vocabulary over time. Until very recently, Chinese has been the primary source of these layers. Sporadic borrowings came into Chinese during that early period, the earliest period of contact, around 2,200 years ago, and they've been trickling into the language ever since. But meanwhile, there have been 2 great waves of borrowing. The Great Wave in the 8th and 9th centuries, the Sino-Korean vocabulary, and then the Great Wave from Japan at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. And who knows, perhaps a 3rd Great Wave from China is on the way. The future influence of other languages on Korea can't be predicted with certainty, but one thing we can say for sure is that the palimpsest of language is never finished, and the current layered state of the language will serve as a canvas on which the future paints. Thank you.
Gentlemen,